Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. I hope you're all doing well. If you are new to my channel, please consider subscribing if you end up liking this video. So today I have another heinous history case for you guys, and you might have heard of this one before. Today we are talking about the Bloody Benders. The Benders settled in Kansas in 1870, and they set up a business with the sole purpose of drawing in unsuspecting travelers so that they could systematically kill them. And they killed so many people that they ended up getting this whole thing down to an art. Each member of the family had their own specific job that they were to do when they were murdering their victims. But then they made a mistake and they killed a very prominent person, and his family would never give up until they figured out what had happened to him. And this would be the downfall of the Benders. And what's really fascinating about this case is that crime scene photography had just really started to become a thing. So there are actual crime scene photos for this case, and I will be including as many of those as I can in this video. And now let's just go ahead and jump in. But before we get into today's case, I'd like to talk to you about today's sponsor, Toon Blast. Toon Blast is a free-to-play mobile game where you get to solve thousands of puzzles by blasting cubes and creating powerful combos to progress through the levels. The game follows the Toon Gang, which includes Cooper Cat, Wally Wolf, and Bruno Bear, and you get to help the Toon Gang travel around the magical world by completing levels. And they're all super cute, but Bruno Bear is definitely my favorite. There are challenges sprinkled throughout the game where you have to save Bruno, and those are intense, I'm not gonna lie. You have to save Bruno before the clock runs out, and I've never lost Bruno, but I've definitely come dangerously close. You all know how much I love mobile games, and this one has quickly become one of my favorites. It's super easy to learn, and it's a great game to play when you just want to escape from daily life. The levels definitely get a little harder as you progress. I was stuck on level 74 forever, and I finally just finished that one, and I'm on level 75 now. I love it when you can combine the items. Like right now I have 2 rockets, and they combined, and it's just so satisfying watching them like ripple through all the cubes. There are lots of mini games that you can play as well, and you'll get rewards for completing those. And the mini games are so fun and challenging. And Toon Blast does not require a Wi-Fi connection, so it's the perfect game to play if you're just on the run, or you're in a plane, or maybe you're just somewhere where your Wi-Fi connection is not the best. I love that there are no ads in this game, so that means no disruptions when you're trying to play. There are millions of reviews and high ratings on the App Store and Google Play, and you can try out Toon Blast for free for yourself by clicking the link in the description box or the pinned comment, or you can just scan the QR code on the screen. And if you use my link, you'll get 3 hours of unlimited lives and 100 free coins. And if you do decide to try out Toon Blast, I would really appreciate it if you used my link or my QR code, because it really does help me out. Thanks so much to Toon Blast for sponsoring this video, and now let's get back into the case. This story begins in the state of Kansas in the 1870s. Kansas at this time was mostly miles and miles of wild frontier land, and after the Civil War ended in 1865, the population in Kansas increased big time. This was mostly because of the Homestead Act, which made it possible for the head of the family to stake claim on 160 acres of vacant land in exchange for a small filing fee. This drove a lot of people out west, since there were millions and millions of acres of land being offered for such a low price. The person would also be required to live on the land for 5 years, and during that time they were to make improvements by cultivating the land and establishing farms and stuff. And once that 5 years was up, the land would officially belong to the resident. You could also expedite the process by paying $1.25 per acre. If you chose to go that route, you would only have to remain on the property for 6 months before getting the deed to the land. And this was actually devastating to the Native Americans that inhabited the western region. They were watching all of these settlers coming further west into their territories, and this forced a lot of them out. Some tribes were relocated from their land by force, and they were transported to different areas just to make room for settlers. So since Kansas was known to have miles and miles of vacant land, lots of settlers were coming into the area. In 1870, there were 5 families of so-called spiritualists that came to Labette County, Kansas to settle down. And one of those families was the Bender family. Now, not much is known about the Benders before they moved to Labette County, but they definitely made an impression on the locals when they arrived in the area. So when this case broke, a lot of people around the area started coming forward with their impressions. And the general consensus was that the Benders were really bizarre. So first we have John Bender Sr., or maybe William Bender Sr. He's referred to as both in the newspaper articles on this case, but he was mostly just known as Pa Bender. He was the father and husband of the family, the patriarch. He was said to be a huge man man. Some even described him as looking like a bear standing on 2 feet, and he looked to be in his early 60s. He was not friendly at all, and he spoke with a really deep guttural voice. Most of the locals believed that he was of German descent. He didn't seem to know much English, so he really didn't speak to the other people in the area very often. The locals said that Pa Bender was, quote, repulsive, a hideous brute without a redeeming trait, dirty, profane, and ill-tempered. So yeah, he was not a very well-liked person in the area. Next, we have the wife and mother, Elvira Bender. Everyone knew her as Ma Bender. Ma Bender was in her 50s, and she was also not very well liked in the town. Some even described her as a she-devil. She was described as a large and very unattractive woman. She seemed to always have a scowl on her face. She spoke with a thick German accent, or what locals assumed was a German accent, but some did say that they thought maybe she was Dutch. Like I said, we don't really know where these people came from, but it was believed at the time that they were German immigrants. And Ma and Pa Bender had 2 kids, a son named John Bender Jr., who was in his mid to late 20s when they arrived in Lebec County, and a daughter named Kate Bender, sometimes called Katie, and she was also in her 20s. John Bender Jr. was said to be very strange. He would break out in a creepy giggle at random times, and some of the locals thought that he might have had some learning difficulties. And lastly, Kate Bender. She was perceived by the locals as the leader of the family. She was the most outgoing. She was also said to be very attractive. The local men loved her, and some have even said that she was so beautiful that she looked totally out of place in this rough area of Kansas. There is little to no confirmed record of these people, so over the years following this case, lots of theories and rumors about the Benders started surfacing. Some people believe that this wasn't actually a family of 4, a mom, a dad, and 2 kids. Some actually believe that Ma and Pa Bender were not even married. They were actually brother and sister. And that John Jr. and Kate were not brother and sister, they were actually married. And if they were actually brother and sister, it's thought that Kate and John Jr. had an incestuous relationship, which we will talk more about later. Again, these are just some of the many theories that have come up over the years surrounding this family, and as far as I know, none of this has ever been proven. But whatever the case, when they arrived in Kansas, they were passing themselves off as your average everyday family of 4. So when the Benders arrived in Lebec County, they filed for homestead on 160 acres of land right off the Osage Trail. The Osage Trail was a major thoroughfare running through the southeastern corner of Kansas. Lots of people traveled down the Osage Trail when they were going through Kansas. The trail ran from Fort Scott to Independence. It was basically the equivalent to what a major highway is nowadays. So in 1870, Pa and John Jr. arrived in Lebec County, Kansas, and they staked their claim on the 160-acre plot of land right off of the Osage Trail. And the property backed up to a huge apple orchard. Now, remember, in order to eventually gain ownership of the land, you had to make improvements, build houses, establish farms, and keep the grounds nice and tended to. And that's exactly what the Benders did. They built chicken coops, fencing for farm animals. They eventually ended up with several farm animals. They built horse corrals and a well, and of course they built a house on the property as well. And when they started to build the house, the first thing they did was purchase a big slab of sandstone, and this was to be the floor of the cellar. Then they dug a tunnel leading from the cellar up into the cabin. Then they built the tiny 2-bedroom cabin on top of the cellar, and it was about 100 yards off of the Osage Trail. Ma Bender and Kate arrived in Lebec County in 1871 to meet up with Pa and John Jr. They had waited to arrive in Kansas until the house was built and everything so that they could just move right in. And since their new property was right off of a major thoroughfare, they decided to turn their home into an inn and grocery. So they made a sign that said grocery, and they put this on the front of their home. And this was actually a genius idea because an inn and grocery would be a definite stop for any weary traveler on the trail. Their home was very small, but the travelers could at least come in, grab some supplies from the grocery, and maybe stay for a hot meal and sleep indoors for the night. So using the cloth from their covered wagon as a curtain, they created a partition to separate the 2 rooms. In the front of the house, you had the little grocery store with some supplies, including tobacco, grain, coffee, apples, and soap. There was also a table in that room as well, and a small kitchen, and this is where their customers would sit and eat. And on the other side of the curtain, there was a small sleeping area. So as I mentioned earlier, the family claimed to be spiritualist. And this was especially the case for Kate Bender. She actually started her own business advertising herself as a medium and a healer, claiming that she could heal blindness and deafness, among lots of other things. She would even conduct seances for grieving widows who had husbands who had died in the Civil War, and she would claim that she could see and hear their spirits. Kate and John Jr. would attend the local Sunday school, and they kind of tried to blend in with the others, but they were just so strange, and they would say and do things that just made people really uncomfortable. So Kate called herself a professor, and she would give lectures on spiritualism and healing and stuff like that. But during these lectures, she would also sprinkle in really odd things. Kate was even quoted advocating for incestuous relationships with siblings. She said, quote, "Shall we confine ourselves to a single love and deny our natures their proper sway? Even though it be a brother's passion for his own sister, I say it should not be smothered." And this comment really raised eyebrows because Kate and John Jr. were said to be a little too close. A lot of people thought that they were having a sexual relationship just based on how they acted around each other. They were very flirtatious and extremely affectionate with each other. But like I mentioned earlier, some people have said that they were actually married and not siblings. And unfortunately, we'll probably never know the true nature of their relationship. Like I mentioned earlier, Kate was said to be very beautiful. She was also described as voluptuous, and she supposedly had many relationships with other men in the area. And the men would all follow her around like little puppy dogs as well. She could get them to do pretty much whatever she wanted them to do. In fact, in one source, it was said that when Kate had a flyer printed advertising her skills as a healer and a medium, she had the local men go around and pass out the flyers for her. And they happily did it. She had them wrapped around her little finger. And one of the men who was really obsessed with Kate was their neighbor, a man named Rudolph Brockman. And Rudolph Brockman comes back up later in the case. But even though she had all of these men after her, she never really gave them too much attention aside from the occasional hookup. She always returned home to her family so they could conduct the actual Bender family business. And that business was the killing of random travelers passing through the Osage Trail. These travelers would stop at the end as they were passing through the area for a hot meal and a safe place to sleep for the night, but many of them would never leave the Bender family inn. Based on the state of the bodies and eyewitness accounts from people who had actually managed to escape the inn, this is how the Benders systematically killed at least 11 people, although the actual victim count is thought to be in the 20s. It would start with an unsuspecting traveler. They would stumble upon the inn and grocery as they were making their way down the Osage Trail. They would stop in for dinner and a place to stay for the night. Some likely even just stopped in to get supplies from the grocery. Kate would be the one to answer the door and greet them and then guide them into the house. Kate would then offer them food and ask them to sit at the head of the table. Now, the seat that they were instructed to sit in was not facing the curtain that acted as the partition. The victim would actually be sitting with their back to the curtain, and they would be sitting so close to the partition that the back of their heads would sometimes be touching the canvas. Kate would sit with them at the table and engage them in small talk, making sure to ask them about their families and their financial situation. She would ask them, does your family know where you're headed? And are you traveling with a lot of valuables? Things like that. A lot of the people traveling down the Osage Trail would be in the process of relocating to new areas. The men would often go ahead of their families to establish land and get things going. So because of this, a lot of the men were traveling alone and with a lot of valuable possessions and money with them. So once Kate asked them some seemingly harmless questions, she would then decide if the person was a good candidate to be murdered. And if they were deemed to be a good candidate, she would then give a signal, and Pa Bender or John Jr. would sneak out from behind the curtain and bash the person's head in with a hammer. And the victim would never have seen it coming. Then they would open a trap door that they had built under the dining room table that led down to the cellar. The body would then be pushed down into the cellar where Kate or Ma Bender would slit their throats just to ensure that they were dead. Then the entire family would strip them of any valuables, including the clothes that they were wearing. Then they would just be left there in the cellar until the family figured out how to dispose of the body. And Kate's popularity in the area definitely helped lure in victims. She had really made a name for herself in the area as a medium and a professor, and also she was very attractive, so several men would just stop by the inn just to talk to Kate. The Bender's first victim is believed to have been a man named William Jones in May of 1871. William Jones was a stonemason, and he was traveling down the trail towards Independence to buy a plot of land, and he just happened to be carrying a lot of cash with him at the time. After being missing for a few weeks, his body was discovered by two young boys in Drum Creek. His throat had been slit from ear to ear, and the back of his skull had been bashed in. And Drum Creek was not far from the Bender Inn, but the man who owned the property where Drum Creek was located was actually the person of interest in the case for a while, since the body had been dumped on his property, although nothing was really looked into at the time. Then in February of 1872, 2 more victims were found. Their bodies were found in the snow near the town of Oswego, and they had identical wounds on their bodies, bashed in skulls and slit throats. And the identity of these 2 men was never discovered. Again, no one really looked into these murders. Some of the other known victims include a man named Ben Brown, who had been traveling the trail on business. He was traveling in his brand new wagon and horses, and he never made it to his destination. William McCrotty was also traveling the trail and carrying a large sum of cash, estimated to be about $2,600. He was also never seen again. A young man named Johnny Boyle was traveling the trail with $1,900 cash on him. He set out on business, and he was also never heard from again. Then a man named Henry McKenzie disappeared. Now, Henry McKenzie was related to a very prominent couple in the area. A man named Leroy Dick was the township officer in the Osage area, and it sounds like this was the closest thing that they had to like a sheriff. Well, Henry McKenzie was Leroy's wife's cousin. Henry had visited Leroy's home in the Osage Township, and then he set out towards Independence on the Osage Trail to visit some other relatives. And when he left, he was carrying about $2,000 on him. And the Benders just continued their reign of terror throughout all of 1872. And by 1873, Sheriff Leroy was receiving more and more letters from families of missing loved ones. Their friend or relative had set out on the Osage Trail on business or in search of new land, and they hadn't been heard from in weeks. Some of the families actually traveled to the Osage Township to ask questions and try to follow the same path that their loved ones had likely taken. But every time they could only track them to Labette County before they lost their trail. It was like they had just vanished into thin air, and the amount of disappearances was really starting to concern the locals. They couldn't help but notice all these families coming into the area in search of missing travelers, and it was really starting to freak them out. But at this point, there were no leads, and no one suspected the Benders could have anything to do with the disappearances. Then in March of 1873, a man named George Longcore decided that he and his 19-month-old daughter Marianne needed a change. His wife had passed away not too long ago, and he really wanted to move closer to his family in Iowa. So he wrote to his family and friends to let them know that he was headed their way, and he also told them about his travel plans. Then he went to his neighbor and friend, a man named Dr. William York, and he bought a wagon and some horses from him for the journey. He loaded up the wagon with all of his possessions, and he said his goodbyes, and then he and his daughter headed out towards Iowa, traveling along the Osage Trail. And George made the unfortunate mistake of stopping at the Bender Inn for the night, and he and his daughter would never be seen alive again. But this would set off a chain of events that would eventually lead to the discovery of the Bender slaughterhouse. And George Longcore's friend, Dr. William York, becomes a very important part of this story. It would be the murder of Dr. York that would finally put an end to the disappearances in Labette County. As part of my research for this case, I read a book called The Bender Tragedy. This book really stands out from the rest on this case because it was written by a woman named Mary York, who was Dr. York's wife. So since his wife wrote this book herself, we know a lot more details about Dr. York's life than any of the other victims. Dr. York was born in Illinois, but his parents eventually left Illinois and relocated to Fort Scott, Kansas. He graduated from Lind Medical University in Chicago, and he eventually joined the Army. During his time in the Army, Dr. York was taken captive and thrown into a prison in Tyler, Texas, with almost 5,000 other men, and some of the prisoners were tortured by the guards. Dr. York and several others were strung up by their thumbs with their feet kept up off the ground, and the pain was apparently so intense that some of the men didn't survive in the end. Once he was finally free from the prison and the war was over, Dr. York, his wife Mary, and their kids settled on a beautiful plot of land right outside of Independence, Kansas, and he set up a medical practice there. His practice was said to be very successful, and it kept him really busy. From what I could tell, he was the only doctor in the area, so he was constantly seeing patients. Then on March 3rd, 1873, Dr. York decided to go on a little trip to Fort Scott, Kansas to visit his parents, and while he was passing through, he planned to stop at Oswego and Osage Township to visit some friends who owed him some money. He was going to try to collect these debts from these friends. Now, by this time, the disappearance of George and Marianne Longcore had become known to the locals, including Dr. York. When George didn't show up in Iowa around the time that he should have, his family sent letters asking where he was. People in this area had been hearing about all the disappearances on the Osage Trail, and his friends back in Independence Independence knew that something wasn't right. He should have arrived in Iowa by now. Then Dr. York heard that an abandoned wagon and a team of horses, fitting the description of the ones that Dr. York had given to George, had been found near the town of Oswego, and there were signs of foul play. There was blood found on the wagon, but there was no sign of George or Marianne. And a witness said that they saw a large man abandoning the wagon the night before. The horses and wagon were being held in Oswego, so Dr. York decided that while he was on his journey, that he would stop and take a look at the horses and the wagon and potentially identify them as the ones that he'd sold to George Loncourt. So Dr. York left on March 3rd, 1873, and he headed to the nearby town of Independence to stay with his brother, Colonel Alexander York. Dr. York spent the night with his brother, and then he left the next day on March 4th, 1873, to continue on his journey. And he told his brother that he expected to be home with his wife and kids within 10 to 14 days. But of course, we know that that would never happen. It was later discovered that Dr. York did in fact make it to Oswego, and he did identify the wagon. Some of the men in the area were searching all over for George and Marianne, and they were dragging the rivers, they were searching the wooded areas, but nothing was found. Dr. York reportedly told the searchers that it was not likely that George drove the wagon there himself, because it would have taken him out of the way of his destination, which was Iowa. Dr. York believed that George and Marianne had been murdered in a different location, and then the killers had moved the wagon to another spot. And before he left, Dr. York promised the men that he would launch a full investigation as soon as he made it back home. Dr. York made it to Fort Scott to visit his parents, and then a week later he headed back home on March 10th, which meant that he would have arrived home on March 11th, much earlier than the 18th, which is when he planned to return. It's thought that he cut his trip short so that he could get back home and start the investigation. So when 14 days passed and Dr. York still wasn't home from his trip, his wife Mary knew something bad had happened, but she really tried to stay positive and push all of the worries out of her mind. She knew that lots of unexpected things could happen on the road that might have made him run late, or maybe he had decided to visit his parents a little longer than he thought. But then the next day, a man came to her home asking to see Dr. York. So Mary told the man that he was still away on his trip to Fort Scott, Oswego, and Osage Township, but he should be home any day now. And when she said this, the man immediately looked concerned. He told Mary that Dr. York had visited him in Oswego on his way to Fort Scott. And before he left, he told the man that he would either visit him one more time on his way back home, or if he decided to go through the Osage Township, he would at least write him to let him know that he returned home. But he never heard from him, and with all the people going missing lately, the man decided to travel to Dr. York's home to check on him. After hearing this, Mary could not deny it any longer. She knew her husband was dead. She alerted both of his brothers, Colonel Alexander York and Senator Edward York, and they set out to look for their brother. Now, not long after Dr. York's disappearance, the people living in Osage Township were growing more and more concerned over all of the missing travelers. So on April 8th, 1873, at the annual school board meeting at Harmony Grove Schoolhouse, a group of locals stood up to voice their concerns. They said they had a feeling that a, quote, secret den of human butchery was operating in the area. And so it was decided that an investigation would be launched and they would conduct searches of every single campsite in the area. And if they didn't find anything after that, they would resort to searching each and every homestead on Osage Trail. There were about 100 people that attended that meeting, and 2 of those people were none other than Pa Bender and John Jr. But I guess they weren't too concerned about all of this because they didn't try to escape at this point. Then a couple of weeks later, the York brothers, along with about 50 other men, arrived in the area. And after questioning some of the townspeople, they learned that Dr. York had been seen in the town of Parsons on March 10th. And a shopkeeper told them that Dr. York had actually come into his shop to buy some cigars. And while he was there, the shopkeeper told Dr. York that if he needed to rest for the night, he should go stay at the Bender family inn. So they all made their way to the Bender home and they started asking questions. The Benders did tell them that yes, Dr. York did in fact stay here for the night, but he left the next morning and we never saw him again. Then Kate offers up her services as a medium. She says that she could use her powers to send herself into a trance and speak to her spirit guide, which was apparently a very old Native American chief. But she says that she can't do this on the spot. She needs a little time to prepare, so she asked them to come back the next day. So most of the men in the group were very suspicious of the Benders right off the start. They were just giving them the creeps. And even though they were all very suspicious of the Benders, they did agree to come back the next day and they left. So the next day they returned to the Bender Inn, but Kate claimed that she went into a trance, but she didn't see anything significant. So Edward York starts asking the Benders questions about other missing people. He asks, what about William Jones? His body was found near here back in 1871. Do you know anything about that? And so John Jr. launches into this whole story about how he had been ambushed near the creek around the same time as the murder, and it was probably the same people who had attacked him. He even takes all of the men down by the creek and he reenacts the entire attack. This was obviously a flimsy attempt to throw suspicion off of them, but it did not work. The men knew that he was lying, and it just made him look even more suspicious. And most of the men wanted to kill the Benders right there on the spot because they were just so convinced that they were guilty. Edward York wouldn't let them do that since there just wasn't enough evidence at the time. So they all left the Bender Inn once again, but this time the Benders knew that the game was over. They had to get out of the area. A couple of weeks later, a wagon was found abandoned on the bank of a river right outside of Osage Township. The wagon had bullet holes all on the sides and there were blood stains everywhere, and it was likely there for days because the horses had gotten so hungry that they had eaten off parts of the wood. This wagon likely belonged to the Benders and they had just abandoned it there. Then on May 1st, a neighbor of the Benders named Billy Toll was passing by and he noticed that the Benders' animals had escaped their enclosures and they were just kind of wandering around the property. So he decided to go up to the house to investigate, and he found a dead calf and the animals appeared to be starving. So he looked into the window and he sees that the house is completely empty and the wagon and the horses are gone. The Benders had obviously abandoned their farm days ago. News of this spreads all throughout the area, making its way to Sheriff Leroy Dick. He gathers a group of about 50 men and he heads over to the Bender home. Hundreds of locals head to the Bender property as well, and there they found a house of horrors. First of all, Edward York finds Dr. York's glasses in the house. They also found 3 hammers that had been hidden under the stove. Also, a knife is found that had dried blood still on it. Then they found the trap door under the table leading down into the cellar, and when they opened the trap door, they were punched in the face with the most foul odor. And most of these men had been in the Civil War and they knew the stench of death, so this smell was unmistakable. They make the decision to literally lift up the house and shift it away from the cellar so that they could get in easier. And when they finally got down there, the entire cellar floor was completely caked in dried blood. They also broke up the sandstone slab, which was the floor of the cellar, and underneath that there were columns that lifted the floor up a few inches, and under that slab they found bones and flesh everywhere. And just whenever they were getting ready to leave the property, they thought that they had really found everything that they were going to find. The sun started to set, and the way the rays were beaming off of the ground, they could see depressions all over the property leading into the apple orchard. So they decided to start digging, and before long, Dr. York's body was discovered. He had been buried head down with his feet at the top of the grave and just barely covered by dirt. His throat had been cut and a perfectly round hole was in his skull. They also found the body of George Longcore. He'd been killed in the same manner as the others, and sadly they did find the body of his 19-month-old daughter, and her body had no sign of trauma or any wounds, so it is believed that she was actually buried alive. And Sheriff Leroy also finds the body of his wife's cousin, Henry McKenzie. He didn't even know that Henry was missing. The bodies of a man and a woman were also found, and it's still not known who these people were. They were never identified. Some of the missing men that we had mentioned earlier were found there on the property as well. Johnny Boyle's body was found at the bottom of the well, and Ben Brown and William McCarty were both buried on the property. All of the bodies had the same type of wounds aside from the baby, a hole in the skull and a cut throat. And the head of one of the hammers found under the stove matched the exact size and shape as the holes in the victims' heads. So it is believed that this hammer was used during the attacks. There were also lots of body parts found in some of the graves, and some of them did not belong to the victims that had been found. So that's why it's thought that the victim count is actually much, much higher than we think. And because these were just random body parts with no actual body that they belonged to, it is thought that the Benders could have dismembered some of the victims. Once word really started to spread about all of this, thousands of people started showing up to the Bender farm. Some were there to try to identify missing loved ones, and some were just there out of curiosity. The locals started to think that there had to be others involved in these murders. It couldn't just be the Benders. It was thought that the Benders were in charge of the killing, and then the victims' possessions and belongings were passed off to someone else to be sold off. The townspeople were very, very angry about all this, and since the Benders weren't around at the moment to take their anger out on, they turned their attention to the alleged accomplices witnesses, including their friend and neighbor Rudolph Brockman. Remember Rudolph Brockman? He was the neighbor who was obsessed with Kate. Well, it became widely believed that he was actually an accomplice to the Bender murders. An angry mob of locals captured him and hung him from a tree until he was almost dead, and then they would let up. And they repeated this 3 more times before Rudolph finally convinced them that he was not involved with the Bender murders, and they finally just had to let him go. However, years later, Rudolph was arrested and sentenced to 20 years in prison for the rape and murder of his own 18-year-old daughter. This became a worldwide case. Papers all over were printing articles about the bloody Benders. And as the story started to spread, people started coming forward with their own close call at the Bender family inn. One woman had visited the Bender inn to ask Kate for a refund on some treatment she'd given her for an illness. The treatment wasn't working and she wanted her money back. And Kate got really angry, but she convinced the woman to stay and take part in a seance. During the seance, the woman said the Benders started speaking gibberish. Then they pulled out a pistol, a club, and a knife, and they started just kind of like moving them around the table. The woman panicked and she ran out of the house as fast as she could, and she hid in some tall weeds right near the property. And she said that Pa Bender and John Jr. got on their horses to search for her, but she managed to escape. Then a man named William Pickering said that he had visited the Bender inn to have dinner and to sleep over, but when Kate insisted that he sit at the head of the table, he refused because there was a gross looking stain on the canvas partition right near where his head would be. This was likely dried blood spatter from hitting the victims over the head with the hammer. Kate got really angry that he refused to sit in the seat, and she threatened him with a knife, but he managed to escape. Then a Catholic priest named Father Paul Ponziglione said that when he visited the inn, he happened to see Pa Bender fumbling around with a hammer, and it made him really uncomfortable. So he made an excuse to go outside. He told them that he needed to go check on his horses and he would be right back, but he took off. Then a woman named Mrs. Fitz visited the inn, and while she was sitting at the head of the table, she could see movement behind the curtain out of the corner of her eye, and then Kate yelled out a command, but the woman managed to jump up and flee before they had time to attack her. The authorities were able to piece together what the Benders had been doing to their victims after they heard these witness accounts from all these close calls with these people, and after seeing the wounds on the victims. And unfortunately, we don't know exactly what happened to the Benders after they left the inn. For years after this case broke, there were stories of sightings of the Benders all over the place. There were so many innocent people who were arrested and held for long periods of time because they were thought to be the Benders. The Benders were said to have been spotted in the town of Thayer at the train station. It was said that John Jr. and Kate went one way and Ma and Pa Bender went another. Then John Jr. and Kate went to an outlaw community near the Texas and New Mexico border. John Jr. was eventually spotted near the border, but he had a stroke before he could be arrested. Again, none of that has been proven. These are just some of the stories that have come up over the years. There were also several groups of vigilantes that claimed that they had caught and killed the family, but no bodies were ever presented. Then in the 1880s, a person fitting Pa Bender's description was arrested for murder in Idaho. Apparently, this man murdered his victim with a hammer. He was taken into custody, and people from the Osage area were called on to come identify him as the Pa Bender. But before they made it there, the man allegedly cut off his own foot in an attempt to escape his shackles, and he bled to death in his cell. And it said that the body was too badly decomposed by the time the people arrived to identify him, so they couldn't say for sure if this was Pa Bender or not. Then 5 years after that, 2 women were arrested in Michigan for theft. They claimed to be Almira Griffith and her daughter Sarah Davis. And again, the authorities were convinced that these 2 women were actually the Ma and Kate Bender. They had Sheriff Leroy come to Michigan from the Osage Township to identify the women, and he was convinced that this was actually Ma and Kate. The women were then transported back to Kansas to stand trial, but before they moved forward, there were a panel of 16 locals created. These 16 people had all dealt with the Benders at some point back in the 1870s, and the panel was supposed to decide whether or not this was in fact Ma and Kate Bender. 7 of the people said with 100% certainty that yes, this was Ma and Kate. 6 of them said no, this is not Ma and Kate, and the others were undecided. And in the end, the women were released. The judge just couldn't go through with the trial if there was any doubt that these were the Benders. So as far as we know, the Benders could have totally escaped justice and just went on to commit more crimes somewhere else. And we'll never know if this was in fact a family of 4, a husband, a wife, and their 2 children, or if they were just 4 people who happened to find each other and they all decided to murder. And that was the case of the Bloody Benders. Let me know what you think about this one down in the comments. And also please feel free to leave me case suggestions in the comments. I am trying to plan out my October lineup, and I'm wanting to focus more on like creepy cases. So let me know if you have any that you would like to hear. Please subscribe if you like this type of content, and follow me on Instagram at Sommer_SanchezYT. And thanks again to Toon Blast for sponsoring this video. Don't forget that you can check my description box or the pinned comment for the link, or you can scan the QR code on your screen. And you'll get 3 hours of unlimited lives and 100 free coins. And as always, I appreciate each and every one of you for watching, and I will see you next time.